Ave Maria, the following program discusses adult themes. Viewer discretion is advised.
All right, well, tonight we have two very special people to Father John Harvey, and they have given of their heart to this apostolate for a long time, and I know from my experience with him and my conversations with him how dear both of them were in his mind and heart. And so we will have the privilege of hearing some very special insights. And because ladies go first, we will hear from Tina.
Just gotta take a deep breath. Do this. Well, good evening, everyone. It's really an honor to be here. When Father Czech invited me to give a testimony at this year's conference, he mentioned that we were especially going to pay tribute to Father Harvey this year. And of course, I couldn't turn down such an invitation. I was both honored and terrified to be asked to give a testimony, and I still am. For years, I've managed to avoid giving a public courage testimony, but I guess my time has come. So I've divided my talk into three parts. First, I'll tell you a little about myself. Then I'll tell you about my entry into courage. And then I'll conclude with my experience of Father Harvey, which I think is the most enjoyable part of the testimony, so I hope you stick around for the whole thing. Okay, so we'll start with me. As a little girl and an only child, I was very much a tomboy. I would wear skirts and dresses when my mother made me, but I definitely preferred to be in pants or shorts, which were much more convenient for running and jumping and general unladylike behavior. I wanted to pass for boy, and frankly, people often mistook me for one. I also noticed that in the comic books and stories that I read when I was little, the heroes were always the male character. The woman was always the one in need of rescuing, and she was the one fawning over the hero. And I wanted to be the hero. I wanted to be the strong one who could be trusted. I didn't want to be the one taking the risk of trusting. I remember when I was 4 or 5 pondering the fact that I couldn't just choose to become a boy. I was a girl and there was nothing I could do about it, and I remember having a keen sense of disappointment about this. I also remember being afraid of my father for most of my childhood and teenage years. I have no doubt that my dad loved me and always wanted what was best for me. He was generous and funny and full of life. However, he also had a terrific temper, which, as some of you well know, I have inherited. And I'd like to take this moment to apologize to those of you who have had the misfortune of experiencing my temper firsthand, and you know who you are. I'm very sorry. Anyway, I was always deeply afraid of my dad's anger, and I think this fear later affected my ability to really trust any man with my heart. Women I felt I could trust. And my mom, the key female figure in my life, was not an angry person. I loved my mom very much, but at the same time, I remember thinking that I didn't want to be like her because when I was little, I perceived her as emotionally weak. She would cry to me after my father had blown up at her, and I saw that she was afraid of him. And I reasoned to myself, as much as I loved my mother, if I grow up to be like her, then one day I too might be married to a man I'll be afraid of. In my early teens, I became more consciously aware of the fact that I was romantically and sexually attracted to members of my own gender. And this was alarming to me. I remembered Jesus' words, if you even look at a woman lustfully, you've committed adultery with her in your heart. And I knew that adultery meant mortal sin, and that mortal sin meant eternal separation from God. I was convinced that I was heading for hell, and there was nothing I could do about it. And this was a rather alarming prospect, and it put me into a state of depression for most of my teen years. I was aware that it was the conflict between my religious beliefs and my still forming sexuality that was putting me in the state of depression. I decided to talk to my parish priest about it. He was very kind and gentle, but he really didn't know how to help me. He convinced me it was just a stage and that I shouldn't think too much about it. Having already fallen into the habits of masturbation and the occasional viewing or reading of pornography, I became afraid that I didn't have the willpower to spend the rest of my life living out the high demands of Catholic moral teaching. While still attending Sunday Mass and going to confession often, I started to read about other religions and philosophies. I was still a teenager at this time. After much reading, speculating, philosophizing, and praying, and especially because of the witness and example of a close friend's family, as well as my grandmother, I realized that I sincerely believed that there was something special about Christianity. I really did believe the unique claims of Jesus Christ, that he is the Son of God, the Messiah, the Savior of the world. I also remember studying the claims of Catholicism and comparing them to various Protestant teachings. And again, I realized that I genuinely believed that the fullness of faith and truth was found in the magisterial teachings of the Catholic Church. My teenage spiritual journey, prompted by my struggles with same-sex attractions, had brought me full circle. Ironically, I was now more conflicted than ever because I was even stronger in my Catholic convictions and even more aware that active homosexuality was not something I could pursue in good conscience. I kept thinking, if only I become more religious, if I pray harder, maybe God will take these temptations away from me. And my family and friends did start to think of me as something of a religious nut. And honestly, I can't say I blame them. They saw me becoming more overtly religious, while none of them knew what my deep, dark, secret struggle was. And meanwhile, I just kept hoping that God would take this cross away from me, that no one would ever have to know about it. Years later, in my mid-20s, in spite of that kind priest's suggestion that I was just going through a stage, I still found myself primarily attracted to my own gender. It's not that I was never physically attracted to men. Occasionally I was. However, I still found that my deeper emotional and romantic attractions were exclusively for women. I could like all the kind and good qualities in a man, and I could even love a man as an act of my will. But the spontaneous experience of developing a crush on someone or falling in love, that still only happened for me with women. All this time, I had never ever thought of taking any steps towards actually pursuing a homosexual relationship. Then, when I was in my last year of university, I learned that 2 male friends of mine were involved with each other. I also learned that a female friend of mine had come out of the closet and was looking to be in a relationship. It wouldn't be an overstatement to tell you that these revelations kind of rocked my world. I was suddenly very tempted to pursue a same-sex relationship. Remarkably, thus far I had given very little thought to the fact that there were other human beings on this planet going through the same particular struggles and temptations as myself. I was dimly aware that there was a gay community out there, but I'd never been even remotely interested in looking into it because, frankly, I associated it with promiscuity and disease. It was also around this time that I read in my parish bulletin about a local Courage meeting. I'd heard about Courage some years before, but I didn't know we had a group in our city. When I saw that there was a local group, I knew that this was a meeting I needed to attend because of my own personal struggles, and I trusted it would be good for me. After much anxiety and prayer, and more anxiety, I finally made up my mind to call the number. First, I spoke privately with Don, who was then the main contact for the Toronto group. Once Don had ascertained that I was on board with the goals of Courage, he told me where and when the group met. He also mentioned that at that time, there weren't any other women attending the group, but he wanted me to feel welcome to attend all the same. I will always be grateful for this hospitality extended to me by the Toronto Courage group. Even though their membership at the time was all male, they still invited me to attend the meetings because they simply wanted to be supportive of another human being who shared their struggles and their goals. Now, I still remember what was going through my mind as I nervously imagined attending my first Courage meeting. For some reason, I envisioned a dimly lit church with shadowy figures sparsely scattered throughout the pews. It's true. I saw, men with dark glasses and trench coats and fedoras, kind of a James Bond film noir setting. As it turned out, we met in a cozy, well-lit room in the church basement, and nobody was dressed like a character from a 1930s spy movie. The guys were very friendly and welcoming, and I was grateful for their kindness and support. I remember being especially grateful for Bob, or I should say Chase Bob. I really appreciated his presence at my first meetings. Bob, as many of you know, there he is very funny. He has a wonderful way of making people laugh, and that was a real blessing during this very vulnerable time in my life. I should mention that at that time, three of my biggest fears or anxieties were speaking in group settings, speaking to men, and speaking about really personal stuff. So, here I was in a group full of men talking about the most personal things in my life, and amazingly, it was all right. It was safe, I was accepted, and I belonged. Attending those early meetings took a great burden off my shoulders because, as many of us know from personal experience, there's a huge relief which comes with finally speaking honestly and openly about the nature of our struggles and temptations. This, to me, is the great gift of courage. We have a place to go where others not only understand our particular weaknesses, they also share the faith that is near and dear to our hearts. It so happened that during my first year of being a Courage member, I had the privilege of accompanying my grandmother on a pilgrimage of the Marian shrines of Europe. And one of the places we visited was Lourdes. And one of the things you can do when you visit the grotto of St. Bernadette is you can get dunked in the miraculous stream of water, and you're supposed to make a quick private prayer intention just before you go under. Well, my private intention just before getting dunked was that I would one day have the opportunity to work for Courage, which is why I now very solemnly tell people, be careful what you pray for when you go to Lourdes. Okay. On this same pilgrimage, we also had the wonderful blessing of unexpectedly meeting Mother Teresa while walking outside of St. Peter's Square in Rome. Mother Teresa gave my grandmother and I miraculous medals, which I have safely kept till this day. Anyway, after a year of meetings with the Toronto Courage Group, I went off to Steubenville to pursue an MA in theology. During that year on campus at Franciscan University, we did manage to get a Courage meeting going, and once again, I was blessed with a good support system. And as I recall, one of the members is also present here tonight, but I won't mention any names since this is being recorded. Okay. Towards the end of that year in Steubenville, I wrote to Father Harvey in New York and told him how much I admired him and his ministry. I also mentioned that if there was any capacity in which I could work for Courage, I'd be happy to do it. Well, it just so happened that his assistant at the time was about to retire. And it also happened that Father Harvey received my letter on the feast day of St. Francis de Sales. Well, happily, Father took this as a sign that he should hire me. So, we'd never met each other in person, and I was a Canadian citizen who'd have to jump through a few hoops to get the right working papers. But dear Father Harvey was all ready to offer me a job on the strength of the letter I'd written and because of the significant date on which he'd received it. And I was over the moon happy about this. I still remember listening to the phone message Father left at my place in Steubenville. To be honest, I wasn't quite sure what he was saying on the message, and I had to listen to it a few times, being in American accents, But when it was... But when I finally figured out that he was offering me a job, I was thrilled. And I hadn't finished my MA at Franciscan, but I knew I could continue to pursue it from other locations through their distance ed program. So I made plans to go back home briefly to Toronto after my school year, and then relocate to New York City. Now, another miracle that occurred at this time is that my parents, my Indian parents, didn't object to their only child, a female, going off to New York City, where she'd never been before, to live on her own and work for a church ministry. Now, in case you missed it, the key words in that sentence were Indian parents, female, only child, New York City, live on her own in church ministry. So, that, my friends, was a huge miracle, that I was able to launch off on what appeared to be an impractical and potentially dangerous venture into a state of certain poverty with no opposition from my parents and only support. I really felt God had a hand in that. I also remember, as I was getting ready to leave Steubenville, that I had a few loose ends to tie up. And I thought to myself, Lord, I just need about $500 to cover a few outstanding expenses. Then at least I can arrive in New York on a better footing. So I started saying a novena to St. Joseph that I would receive some financial help. And apparently right about this time, Maria, who was my predecessor, said to Father Harvey, Father, Tina will probably need some money for moving expenses. And apparently Father responded and said, you're right, how much should we send? And Maria, God bless her, said, I think you should send her $500. Well, apparently, dear Father immediately wrote a check for $500 and mailed it off to me without telling me a word. So you can imagine my expression when I received a check in the mail from Father Harvey for the exact amount I'd been praying for. You know, I thought the Holy Spirit is definitely at work. So, well, okay, now I get to tell you about the most adventurous part of all, which was my actual Courage experience in New York City. What was wonderful for me about being part of Courage in New York was the strong sense of community. There, I was blessed for the first time with the company and support of other female Courage members. We had our own women's meetings led by Father Harvey himself, but we also had the company of the Courage men at Days of Recollection and at various social events like, I have permission to mention names here, like Brad's 4th of July parties or summer afternoons at Yvonne's place in Long Beach. I still remember when a group of us took dance lessons together. I believe we learned to Lindy Hop, waltz, and merengue, and that was fun. And then there were Sally's historic and personal tours of Little Italy, cooking lessons with young Frank, and group outings to Saturday matinee movies. And I just want to mention, if you want an exciting afternoon, you should really go see a movie with Regina. She gets very caught up in the movie, and you're guaranteed to leave with a smile on your face, you know. We got shushed while watching Finding Nemo. Because Regina was on the edge of her seat, and just she couldn't stand the suspense, so. Sorry. There were also dinners at local diners, Irish pubs, and various restaurants. We went to coffee houses, concerts, and sometimes even black tie events. In case you were wondering, the guys wore the black ties. Courage in New York City was truly a community experience. And perhaps best of all, I had Father Harvey for a boss. And I have to tell you that having Father Harvey for a boss has pretty much spoiled me for life, because now I tend to have unrealistic expectations of my subsequent bosses. A typical day at the Courage office meant you got a hug from Father in the morning and a blessing from Father at the end of the day. My favorite time of the week was Friday evenings. After a long and stressful week at the office, and believe me, it was stressful. Angelo and Pat, I know, will back me up in this. We would stop answering the phones on Friday at 5:30 p.m., and we'd pour ourselves a drink. Now, don't be scandalized, it was just one drink, not 6 or 7. Father would have scotch, and I'd have some wine. And we'd just put our feet up and talk about anything under the sun. And usually I'd run out to get us a bite to eat from a place downstairs called Bagel Mavens, or Beggin' Megan's, as Father would call it. I don't know why, but Father would always make up his own version of certain names and then stick to the made-up version. At least once a month, we'd go out for dinner or lunch together, and he always encouraged me to feel free to talk about whatever was on my mind. I've since come to see, much to my regret, that this sort of comfortable, easygoing exchange doesn't always occur in other workplaces. Most people don't get to go to movies or ball games with their boss. And the ball games were great. On a few occasions, Father accompanied Yvonne, Regina, Maureen, and myself to ball games. And whether it was the Brooklyn Cyclones or the New York Mets, or on rare occasions even the Yankees, Father would get happily caught up in the game, explaining each play of the game to us from start to finish. We loved being his girls, you know. I also remember when the movie The Exorcist was re-released in the year 2000. Both Father and I were interested in seeing it. And I have to tell you, it's very cool to enter a movie theater filled with people waiting to see The Exorcist when you're accompanied by a priest. Especially an older priest who's clearly wearing his collar, a black blazer, and his signature black fedora. It reminded me of that famous scene in The Exorcist where Father Merrin first arrives at Regan's house, and you have that iconic image of a priestly silhouette pausing under the streetlight. I mean, it was like arriving with Max von Sydow himself, and I think a couple of people at the theater may have actually thought it was him. The sweetest part was when Father, you know, all gentlemanly-like and fatherly as usual, said, "Now, dear, if you start to get frightened, you can hold my hand." And I believe I did hold his hand a couple of times. Of the many, many good things Father Harvey did for all of us, I think the most significant and meaningful thing he did for me personally was come and visit my dad when he lay dying of lung cancer in a hospital bed. Father Harvey was one of the few priests my dad really liked and respected. I was hoping that Dad would have the opportunity to see a priest, but I was reluctant to raise the topic, knowing how rebellious Dad sometimes was towards religion in general. Well, one day when I was on the phone with my already hospitalized father, quickly planning my return home to Toronto, Father Harvey happened to be in the room with me, and he asked to speak to Dad on the phone. I heard Father say to Dad, "You know, I'd really like to come and visit you and help you prepare your soul for eternity." He said it directly and gently. According to my mom, my dad told her afterwards that he felt a wonderful, uplifting presence when Father Harvey proposed visiting, and Dad didn't hesitate to say, "Yes, please come." A few days after I got home to Toronto, Father Harvey was also there in the hospital, hearing my dad's confession and giving him Holy Communion. And 9 days later, my dad entered eternity, and Father Harvey flew up to Toronto again to say a private funeral mass for the repose of my father's soul and for the consolation of my family. I was so grateful to Father Harvey for this. And I also want to mention here, to give my own dad full credit, that he did learn to be warm and affectionate later in life. And I also learned to be affectionate with him. In my late teens and early 20s, Dad and I learned to hug each other more often and to tell each other, "I love you." My parents' relationship with each other also grew as my dad learned to treat my mom with more respect and consideration. A good measure of healing had already begun in our family, and our family continues to grow and heal to this day, even while Dad is in eternity and we're still here on this earth. As I said, I have been spoiled. As a Catholic person dealing with same-sex attractions, I've had a dream team of support. Father Harvey is my boss, confessor, and spiritual director, a plethora of brave and faithful priests and courage, Peter Rudiger as a friend and therapist, and the Courage support system with all my amazing brothers and sisters in Christ to turn to for encouragement and friendship. I will share with you honestly that over my years as a Courage member, in spite of all that wonderful support, I have still had my struggles and my falls. During those times, I struggled most with the fact that I was working for a ministry that promoted chastity, but sometimes was failing miserably in living out that chastity in my own life. At those times, it felt like the devil was dancing on my head and taunting me constantly. But during those times, Father Harvey was always a gentle father, offering me guidance and spiritual direction. I'm reminded of that scripture verse, "The bruised reed he does not break," and that was how Father treated me when he knew I was struggling. And to be honest, to this day, I still find myself vulnerable to same-sex attractions. However, I'm no longer obsessed with asking God to take this cross away from me as I was when I was a teenager. Most of the time, I'm able to view my weakness as a permitted thorn in the flesh that keeps me humble and hopefully becomes a source of grace. Other times, I happily don't think about it at all. And when I do, I remind myself that much of my life is a mystery even to myself. I don't have all the answers here and now, and I don't have to have them. I try to maintain an openness to God's grace and healing in whatever form that takes. It's likely I will remain single all my life, as thus far I haven't discerned God calling me to either married life or religious life. But that's just me. God's call in each life is different. Only He knows the state of life that's best for each of us. When Father Harvey suddenly passed away last December, 4 years after my dad's death, I was grateful that I could come down and attend Father's funeral mass, that I could be there to pray and mark that significant event the same way he'd been there for my family when Dad died. Every one of us has his own way of mourning or remembering those who have passed on, and I'm sure each of us are remembering Father and honoring him in our own private ways. Me, I like to imagine Father Harvey's entry into eternity like this. He suddenly finds himself walking into a giant baseball stadium, packed with souls cheering wildly, and then God's voice comes over the loudspeaker saying, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And then I see Father being embraced by Jesus, and then being reunited with his own dear mother and his other relatives and friends. Finally, Father puts on his baseball glove and baseball hat, climbs the pitcher's mound, and starts to play ball with some of his favorite sports heroes. Now, I've always believed, even while Father was alive, that one day he would be canonized. For years we plotted to ask Timmy to give Father a haircut just so we could save some of his hair as first-class relics. Alas, we never got around to that. I know there are a lot of human beings who live holy and saintly lives who remain uncanonized, but I believe the work Father Harvey started through Courage is something very, very special, and that God will bless this ministry further by giving special recognition to the very dear soul who helped to start it. And if we haven't done so already, perhaps in the next few months we can all take some time to write down how this dear priest has positively impacted our lives, so we can be ready when the church starts collecting such information. And I pray that time will soon come. I'll close now with some words of wisdom from Father Harvey. Sometimes Father would see that I was obsessively worrying about something petty or something from the past I couldn't do anything about. And he would say to me, "You know what I say, dear, when I'm worrying about something I can't do anything about?" "What, Father?" "I say, the hell with it." That's good advice. That's great advice. Perhaps we should all say to those neurotic worries that obstruct our full experience of joy, and to those dark memories that keep us in a state of shame and regret, the hell with it. Because now, in addition to Jesus and Mary and the angels and saints and the souls in purgatory, we also have Father Harvey interceding on our behalf. And I believe right now he's urging each of us to keep pressing forward with God's grace until we also fully enter the joy of the kingdom. And that should really be a source of courage for all of us. Amen? Amen. Question or two, if you have any, that is. If you don't, that's all right.
I just want to say that was beautiful.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I want to say thank you to, I know so many of you have been praying because you know how anxious I was about doing this, so I really, really, really appreciate it, because every time I start to get nervous, I think, they're praying for me, so, so, okay. Yes?
Where are you working now? What are you doing now?
Oh, I'm working at the University of Toronto as a program assistant and a web administrator, and my main focus right now is helping my mom look after my grandma, so my job right now is, it's just a job. It's something not too stressful so I can focus on family. So, yes.
What kind of scotch did Father Harvey like?
I know the answer to that. Okay, Chivas Regal. He liked Chivas Regal. Yeah, that's right. So, that. Yeah.
But he wasn't picky if he couldn't get the Chivas Regal.
That's true too. Yeah.
Since 1999, and Tina brought me in. And Father, you were each one of us was, of course, very special to Father Harvey in our own uniqueness. And I don't want to anyone to take this as meaning that they were any less special to Father. But Tina, you were the emotional daughter of his heart.
It's I always think like all the neat ways that God works in our lives. I really feel like with Father's, he was so gentle. We all know how gentle and kind he was, and it was so healing to have a male figure in my life like that. And the fact that anything under the sun really you could talk to him about. It was really great, and I think we, especially us in the women's group, we felt very, very blessed to have that kind of a male presence in our lives.
Will you write a book about your experience?
Well,
You might get a check sent to you.
Maybe maybe I was meaning to do more writing, so maybe I'll do that one day. Yeah. Thanks. Hi, James.
I just want to say it was a privilege and a pleasure being in those meetings with you.
Thank you.
17 years ago in Steubenville.
Yes, yes, likewise. We were very fortunate to get a group started in Steubenville as well, and met some great people there, and some of you know.
Still going.
And you're still going. Okay. Yes, Tracy.
Have you prayed to Father Harvey since his death, and have you had any special experience of his presence?
Well, yes, I'm like all kinds of things. That I was like, Father, please help me with this, with that, and one of the things I think Alan is here somewhere. He would one of the things that happened significantly 6 months after his death, exactly 6 months, was we've been having some issues in Toronto with people are trying to start these gay-straight alliances in the high schools, and we're trying to oppose it on the grounds of basically because the terminology is problematic, and it's so great because 6 months to the date of Father's death, this fantastic pastoral letter came out through the Canadian bishops, and it was just really, really well worded, and we just felt like that was a result of Father's intercession for us. Another thing, I guess, on a more personal note, is at home. My grandmother said that the other day, she's struggling with dementia now, and she said, who is that priest that came and visited us a little while ago? And I said, you mean Father Harvey? She said, yes, I see him sometimes. And I'm like, wow, that's great, So I'm thinking maybe he's, bringing her consolation or comfort in some way in her condition right now. So. Anything else? Oh, hi, Tim.
Hi, Tina. Thank you for your testimony. It was very good. I wanted to ask you, are there courage meetings in Toronto, and do you attend them?
Trying to pin me down. No. Yes, there are definitely courage meetings in Toronto, and it's a pretty stable group, and they meet regularly. And I confess, right now, I have not been attending them regularly. I drop in from time to time. One of the things that I kind of experienced post working for Courage is I think any place when you, especially in ministry, when you work there a very, very long time, you kind of feel a little burnt out, right? And plus sometimes I think because I spent so much of my life, like I was dwelling on this topic of same-sex attractions like round the clock, because it was my work, but it was also my social life, because these were my friends and people I hung out with. It's like sometimes a part of me just, I'm being honest with you, sometimes I just want to take a break from the topic. Like I just want to sit back and do other things and pursue other interests. I'm grateful to know that there is a group there in Toronto, and if I should need, suddenly something comes up and I need support, I know there are meetings I can go to. So there's my honest answer to that, yeah. Anything else?
Tina, thank you.
It's okay.